Tom had been driving down the same lonely stretch of highway 4 hours. The night was dark, the only light coming from his car's headlights. Fatigue was setting in when he spotted a figure standing on the side of the road. As he got closer, he saw it was a young woman, drenched from the rain, hitchhiking. Tom hesitated, but then decided to pull over, figuring she must be in trouble. The woman climbed into the car, dripping water onto the seat. She was pale, with a faraway look in her eyes. Tom tried to engage her in conversation, but she remained silent, staring ahead blankly. The eerie silence grew as they drove on, Tom's unease increasing with each passing mile. Eventually, they reached a small town. Tom decided to stop at a gas station to get help for the woman. As he pulled into the lot and turned to speak to her, he was shocked to find the passenger seat empty. The woman had vanished without a trace, leaving the seat completely dry. Panicked, Tom ran into the gas station and asked the attendant if he had seen the woman. The attendant looked puzzled, telling Tom he was the only one who had pulled in. Shaken, Tom left, unable to explain what had happened. The next morning, still troubled, Tom stopped at a diner. He overheard locals talking about a ghost story in the area and joined the conversation. An older man told him about Anna, a young woman who had drowned in the river 10 years ago and whose ghost was said to wander the highway, looking for a ride home. Determined to find answers, Tom visited the river where Anna had drowned. He felt a strange sense of calm, almost as if her presence was with him. He then made it his mission to learn more about her tragic fate. He discovered that Anna had been a promising young woman who mysteriously disappeared one night, only to be found in the river days later. Tom returned to the spot where he had picked her up, hearing a faint whisper saying, "Help me." Following the voice, he found an old locket half buried in the mud, with a photo of Anna inside. He took the locket to the local priest, who agreed to help. They held a small ceremony by the river, praying for Anna's soul. That night, as Tom drove home, he felt a peaceful presence in the car. Glancing in the rearview mirror, he saw Anna sitting in the back seat, her expression serene. She nodded at him before fading away. Tom knew he had helped a lost soul find her way home. From that night on, Tom never saw the ghostly hitchhiker again. He kept the locket with him, a reminder of the vanishing passenger and the profound impact she had on his life. The storm had rolled in unexpectedly, turning Jake's evening drive into a harrowing journey. The rain pounded relentlessly on his car's roof, and the wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear. Lightning flashed intermittently, illuminating the dark, winding road ahead. As he drove cautiously, Jake noticed a figure standing by the roadside, barely visible through the heavy rain. He squinted, realizing it was a young girl, shivering and soaked to the bone. Concerned for her safety, he pulled over and rolled down the window. "Are you okay?" he called out, trying to make himself heard over the storm. The girl looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. She seemed unable to speak, merely nodding in response. Jake opened the passenger door, and she climbed in, her small frame trembling from the cold. She was drenched, her clothes clinging to her like a second skin. Jake turned up the heat, hoping to provide some warmth. "Where are you headed?" he asked, but the girl remained silent, staring straight ahead. He tried again, asking her name, but she didn't respond. Her silence was unnerving, but Jake decided not to press her further, figuring she must be in shock. After a few minutes, the girl pointed ahead, indicating that he should keep driving. Jake nodded and continued down the road, the atmosphere in the car heavy with an eerie quiet. The only sounds were the rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. As they drove, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The girl's silence and the way she stared blankly out the window gave him a sense of unease. He glanced over at her periodically, hoping she might say something, but she remained mute. Finally, they reached an old dirt road leading to a rundown farmhouse. The girl pointed toward it, and Jake turned onto the narrow path. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and broken, the paint peeling off in large strips. It looked abandoned, and Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He pulled up to the front of the house and turned to the girl, intending to ask if this was really where she wanted to go. But to his shock, the passenger seat was empty. The girl had vanished without a trace, leaving no sign that she had ever been there. The seat was dry, despite her being soaked when she got in. Heart pounding, Jake got out of the car and looked around, calling out for her. There was no response, just the sound of the storm and the wind whistling through the cracks in the old house. He approached the front door, which hung slightly ajar, and hesitated before pushing it open. Inside, the house was dark and dilapidated, filled with the musty smell of decay. Furniture lay in disarray, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. Jake's flashlight beam cut through the gloom as he explored the rooms, looking for any sign of the girl. In one room, he found an old photograph on the floor, partially covered in dust. He picked it up and wiped it clean, revealing a picture of a family standing in front of the farmhouse. Among them was the girl he had given a ride to. Jake's mind raced as he tried to comprehend what was happening. He felt a cold draft and turned to see a faint, ghostly figure standing in the doorway. It was the girl, her eyes sad and pleading. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she faded away. Realizing he had encountered a spirit, Jake felt a mix of fear and sorrow. He left the farmhouse, vowing to learn more about the family in the photograph. Over the next few days, he researched the history of the house and discovered that the family had lived there many years ago. The girl had tragically drowned in a nearby river during a storm, and her spirit had been seen wandering the area ever since. Determined to help her find peace, Jake returned to the farmhouse with flowers and a candle. He placed them on the steps and said a prayer for the girl's soul. As he did, he felt a sense of calm wash over him, and the air seemed to lighten. From that night on, Jake never saw the silent girl again, but he often thought of her. He took a different route home, always remembering the night he had encountered the silent companion and the profound impact it had on him. He hoped that, wherever she was, she had finally found the peace she deserved. Paul had been driving through the countryside on a foggy night, the dense mist clinging to the windshield and making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The winding road was eerily quiet, and the thick fog gave everything a ghostly appearance. As he navigated the twisting turns, he spotted a small figure up ahead, standing by the side of the road. As he got closer, he realized it was a little girl, no older than 8 or 9. She was shivering, wearing a thin dress that was far too light for the chilly night. Paul pulled over, concerned for her safety. He rolled down the window and leaned out. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. "What are you doing out here all alone?" The girl looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. "I'm lost," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to get home." Paul's heart went out to her. "Hop in. I'll take you home. Do you know the address?" She nodded and climbed into the passenger seat. As she settled in, Paul noticed how pale and cold she seemed. He turned up the heater, trying to warm her up. "What's your name?" he asked as he started driving again. "Emily," she replied, her voice soft and distant. "Nice to meet you, Emily. I'm Paul," he said with a reassuring smile. "Where do you live?" She gave him an address that Paul recognized as being a few miles away, in a part of town he wasn't too familiar with. As they drove, he tried to make small talk, but Emily remained mostly silent, staring out the window at the foggy landscape. When they finally arrived at the address, Paul's stomach dropped. The house was old and dilapidated, its windows boarded up, and the yard overgrown with weeds. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. He parked the car and turned to Emily. "Are you sure this is the right place?" he asked, unease creeping into his voice. Emily nodded. "This is my home." Paul hesitated, then got out of the car and walked around to open her door. But when he looked inside, the seat was empty. Emily was gone. Panic surged through him as he called out her name, searching the area around the house, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Confused and frightened, Paul decided to investigate the house. He pushed open the creaky front door and stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The interior was just as decayed as the exterior, with cobwebs hanging from the ceiling and dust covering every surface. The air was thick with the smell of mold and rot. As he explored the rooms, he found old photographs and toys scattered around, signs that a family had once lived here. In one of the rooms, he found a dusty old photo album. Flipping through the pages, he froze when he saw a picture of Emily, looking exactly as she did when he picked her up, standing in front of the house with her family. The photo was dated over 50 years ago. A cold chill ran down Paul's spine as he realized the truth. Emily wasn't a lost child. She was a ghost, trapped in time, still trying to find her way home. He felt a deep sadness for her, imagining the tragedy that must have occurred here. Paul left the house, his mind racing. He drove straight to the local library, determined to learn more about the house and its history. After hours of searching through old newspapers and records, he found an article about a fire that had destroyed the home 50 years ago. The entire family had perished in the blaze, including a young girl named Emily. The realization hit Paul hard. Emily's spirit had been wandering, lost and alone, for all those years. He returned to the house the next day, bringing flowers and a small toy. He placed them on the steps, hoping to bring some peace to her restless spirit. As he stood there, he felt a gentle breeze and heard a faint, whispered thank you. The air seemed to lighten, and Paul knew that Emily had finally found her way home. He drove away, feeling a sense of closure and a deep respect for the mysteries that lay hidden in the foggy night. From that night on, Paul took a different route home, always remembering the lost child who had found her way. Thanks to his kindness, he often wondered if there were other spirits like Emily, trapped and seeking help, and he made a silent promise to always be willing to lend a hand to those in need, whether they were among the living or the dead. Mike had a long commute from work, and he often found himself driving home late at night. The highway he took was a desolate stretch, flanked by dense woods on either side. For weeks, he had been seeing the same hitchhiker at the same spot every night, a tall man with a hood covering most of his face, his thumb out in a silent plea for a ride. At first, Mike dismissed it as a coincidence, but the sight of the man night after night began to unsettle him. He mentioned it to his friends, who laughed it off, suggesting it was probably someone messing with him or a drifter who had found a regular spot. However, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. One particularly dark and stormy night, curiosity got the better of him. The rain was pouring down in sheets, and the hitchhiker was there, standing in his usual spot, completely unfazed by the weather. Mike's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he debated whether to stop. Finally, he pulled over, his heart pounding in his chest. The hitchhiker walked up to the car, moving with an almost unnatural grace. As he opened the passenger door, a cold gust of wind filled the car. The man got in and pulled back his hood, revealing a gaunt face with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through Mike. The hitchhiker smiled eerily and said, "I've been waiting for you." A chill ran down Mike's spine. He tried to ask where the man was heading, but his voice caught in his throat. The hitchhiker simply pointed ahead, his smile never faltering. Mike nodded nervously and started driving, the silence in the car oppressive. They drove in silence for several miles, the rain pounding on the roof of the car. Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He glanced at the hitchhiker, who was now staring straight ahead, his eyes unblinking. The man's presence seemed to fill the car with an almost tangible sense of dread. Mike tried to make small talk to ease the tension. "So, what's your name?" he asked, his voice trembling. The hitchhiker turned his head slowly to face Mike, his smile widening. "Names are for the living," he replied cryptically. Mike's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. He regretted ever stopping for this man. His mind raced, thinking of ways to end this unsettling ride. As they approached a particularly dark stretch of the highway, the hitchhiker spoke again. "Turn left up ahead," he instructed. Mike knew there was no left turn on this part of the highway. "There's no road there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Turn left," the hitchhiker repeated, more forcefully this time. Compelled by some unseen force, Mike turned the wheel, and to his horror, a narrow, unmarked dirt road appeared, where there had been nothing but trees moments before. He drove down the road, the forest closing in around them. The deeper they went, the colder it got, the trees seeming to whisper secrets in the wind. Eventually, they reached a clearing with an old, dilapidated house in the center. The hitchhiker pointed to it. "This is where I need to go," he said, his voice echoing with an unnatural resonance. Mike stopped the car, his instincts screaming at him to leave. The hitchhiker opened the door and stepped out, turning back to face Mike one last time. "Thank you for the ride," he said, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. "You're free to go." Relief washed over Mike as he watched the man walk toward the house. He quickly turned the car around and sped back down the dirt road, his heart racing. As he reached the highway, He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the house vanish, replaced by the dense forest once more. Mike never spoke of the encounter again, but he found a different route home from that night on. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had narrowly escaped something sinister. He often wondered about the hitchhiker and what would have happened if he hadn't agreed to give him a ride. But one thing was certain: Mike never made it home that night in the way he had before. That night, he had ventured into a realm where few dared to go and came back with a story that would haunt him forever.